Greetings, good people of old Sydney town, and welcome to the Piperston Estates. It is 1826, and you have come to listen to the dark tales of lost Leichhardt. And I promise you will not be disappointed. I trust your horses have not wearied on their travel from the centre of Sydney along the pitted, rutted tracks of the Great Western Highway here tonight. And on that fact, I bid you one word of caution. Upon leaving here tonight and traversing those same lonely, darkened roads, watch out, for evil is afoot. Bands of armed robbers who will take your belongings and perhaps your life too. Let us find out about one such robber, one Bridget Fairless, female robber nonetheless, as we enter the dark world of lost Leichhardt.
And that area around here was rural, open, grazing land. The victim, a carter, had spent the day driving his herd from Parramatta to Sydney, a journey of some 3 to 4 hours. On a dark July evening, the man was tired and in need of food and drink. At Petersham, the man passed Bridget and John walking, somewhat wearily it seemed, along the Great Western Highway. They hailed him down and asked for him to take them a short way in his cart. The carter agreed and they climbed aboard. The press at the time wrote that he good-naturedly consented, and thus the exercise of one of the best feelings of human nature was made subservient to their wicked purposes. I know. A short way up the road, the couple encouraged the man to stop at a house of entertainment. And this may have been called the Cheshire Cheese Public House, which fronted the Great Western Highway at Petersham, but has since been lost to time. The three wary travellers entered the tavern, where they had food and drink aplenty, and some merriment was had by all. Upon coming out, a couple of hours later, encouraged by Bridget, a fight ensued between John and the carter. The fight ended with the carter being knocked out, and with the carter still unconscious, the newspaper reports that the couple, after considerably ill-treating him, rifled his person for all the money he possessed. Fairless was instigator, and she directed her partner to go back to the man and frisk him some more, feeling that, in her words, the old bugger has more. The next day, the police arrived at their door. Connolly and Fairless claimed that it was not them who had committed the crime. They claimed another man had approached them and had started the fight with the carter. But the police searched the house and found the monies and possessions that they stole. They arrested the couple. Connolly and Fairless were tried and sentenced to be hanged at Sydney Central Jail on the 24th of July, 1826. Do we want to find out what their final moments on earth were like? Okay. More than the usual concourse of people was attracted towards the jail and the places within its vicinity in the forenoon of Monday last. An unfortunate female, with a man who had been her accomplice, was destined on that morning to fulfil the dread sentence of law, both having been convicted of robbing a man on the highway. The unfortunate couple left the condemned cell, where they had been for some time previously preparing their minds for the awful and final scene that awaited them. The man named James Connolly, accompanied by the clergyman, the under-sheriff An attendant walked first and was followed by Bridget Fairless, his ill-fated female companion. They took a direction along the terrace in front of the jail, through the central passage, and which opens on to the yard containing a fatal pile of scaffolding. They passed along under the drop and between two crudely constructed coffins, the vehicles that were shortly going to convey their inanimate remains to the grave. And they stopped a few paces from the drop. While Connolly protested his innocence, the woman said nothing. Bridget continued to gaze upon a crucifix with the appearance of resignation and firmness. After passing more than a quarter of an hour in prayer, both rose. Connolly appeared eager to ascend the fatal ladder. His arms were pinioned, as were those of the unfortunate female. They ascended the fatal scaffold, and she with a slow, firm step. The apparatus of death was not long adjusting. The drop fell, leaving them struggling for some moments. The unfortunate criminals then were no longer conscious of what passed around them. Death was not long in seizing on their victims. During the time prescribed by law, their bodies continued suspended at the sport of the winds. They were afterwards coffined and resigned to their friends. A dark tale indeed. Aha! Our forebear, after which this suburb is named. Alas, it is 1850, and our brave explorer, Mr. Ludwig Leichhardt, is gone. To the farmers at the Cagoon cattle station on the Darling Downs of Queensland, he uttered his last words, that he was heading to the setting sun, before starting the journey west across the vast continent some 2 years ago. He and his party of brave souls simply vanished into the air, leaving only his name behind. Courtesy, that is, of one Mr. Walter Beams, resident of the Piperston Estates, who provisioned Ludwig Leichhardt for his expedition and so named this place Leichhardt. And what of Leichhardt now? It has been cursed by the scourge of the larrikin. There they are, filthy larrikins. These are young men from the country, so-called budding bushrangers, on whom, as the journalist said at the time, no sympathy should be wasted, for these are bad men. Let us hear a couple of the stories of their misdeeds. An article in the Daily Telegraph in 1893 reported on a larrikin melee at Leichhardt, a riot of amazing proportions. The police arrest of a woman for vagrancy at the corner of Norton Street and Parramatta Road kicked the whole thing off, and it escalated into a full-blown riot that ran throughout the neighbourhood. A bystander called William Norris had gone up to the arresting officer when he arrested Susan Fegan for vagrancy. He put his arm around the constable's throat and said, "If you don't let her go, I will choke you." A struggle ensued between the two men and several larrikins went to Norris's assistance. 2 more constables arrived on the scene, but the larrikins started picking up stones and missiles and they began to fire in all directions. At this point, other men descended on the scene and formed a circle around the police officers to protect them from further beating. However, the larrikins by this point had been overtaken by animalistic rage and were fighting like wild beasts to get into the circle where the constables cowered. And just when those poor constables were believing they would be attacked by the gang, a lucky break occurred and a tramcar suddenly hove into view. Seeing their opportunity to escape, the police managed to get on board. However, the gang was not going to let them go that easily. The larrikin elements began to bombard the tram with blue metal and anything of a dangerous character they could lay their hands on. Women and children on the tram cars screamed with fright, and owing to the many obstructions, it was with some difficulty that the motor driver could start the tram, and when it began to move, the crowd fairly shrieked with rage and followed the tram like a pack of wolves, hoping to overtake it at the next stop at the junction in Norton and Marion Street, just down here. The guard, however, was not to be had in this way, and blew his whistle for the tram to run through and onto Marlborough Street, thus giving the police chance to disembark and cage their charges before the relief party came up. The men, including Norris, were brought before Glebe Police Court and were each fined £5 or 3 months in jail if they couldn't pay, for assaulting a police officer and maliciously throwing stones at a tram car with intent to injure the persons travelling therein. And what became of Susan Fegan, whose arrest prompted the affray? Times were hard for people that had no visible means of support. She was sentenced to 1 month's hard labour for having insufficient lawful visible means of support, which was an unfair and harsh punishment of the times. So there was a lot of larrikinism and gangs happening in Leichhardt in the late 1800s. And we have another story in the early 20th century, nonetheless, 1934. And this crime, perpetrated by a gang, was so meticulously planned that the police commented on its cunning. For the heist in question, the gang had gone to a trouble of hiring an empty shop on Parramatta Road, near the boundary between Leichhardt and Annandale. They disguised the shop as a legitimate business, even going so far as to stock it with racks of fruit and vegetables. The gang had a specific target in mind: local lorry driver Donald Rowe of Earlwood, who sold tobacco and shops in the area for his employer, a local merchant. At 3 p.m. on the day in question, Donald was making his usual rounds when he was hailed by a man on Marion Street. The man ordered a quantity of tobacco and asked for it to be delivered to that shop on Parramatta Road. After stocking up at his boss's warehouse, Donald dutifully drove over to the shop in the late afternoon to make the sale. When Donald pulled up, the man emerged from the store and asked him to bring some things in from the truck and to put them on the shelf at the back of the store. Donald did this and then claimed he was seized from behind, a towel drawn tight over his mouth and eyes, and his legs and arms tied with cord. He struggled, but to no avail. He was held tight. From the conversation that swirled around him as he struggled, Donald suspected that 3 men were involved. After incapacitating Donald, the men searched his pockets. They removed £50, the property of his employers. After they left the building, the men threatened poor Donald, telling him they would smash in his skull if he called for help or tried to escape. They then drove away in the victim's lorry, which contained £250 worth of stock. It took the victim an hour to free himself and to raise the alarm. Do we want to hear another story closer to home? Yeah. A ghostly story closer to home. Yeah. I'm going to ask you a question for who is Angelo Duros? In this very place, where Crosstalk Records now stands, a major crime was committed. Let us go back to the 1990s. This place was known as the Ithaca Coffee Lounge, owned and managed by one Angelo Duros, a Greek immigrant. A reputable business, it would appear from the outside. But no, for under this facade, Angelo ran a secret video gambling business. Computerized poker machines were housed upstairs, right here. And it wasn't a secret. Somebody was watching. And that someone was this man here. One Mr. Leonard McPherson, notorious thug, gangster, murderer and money collector with a record as long as your arm. He had one of the most fearsome gangs that ever existed in Sydney. He operated between the late 1950s and the mid-90s. And by the time he died, 25 murders had been attributed to him and his accomplices. You may know some of their names. George Freeman, Frederick Paddles Anderson, Stan the Man, Standover Man Smith, a Melbourne hitman who came to Sydney, I guess for a holiday, Chris Flannery. 25 deaths. A lot of them one-way trips out into Sydney Harbour. It was common knowledge there were far more deaths. McPherson took a cut of the gambling earnings from all illegal venues across Sydney. Mr. 10% they called him. And Angelos had not paid up. So he was a marked man. At 11:20 p.m. on the evening of Wednesday, the 5th of December 1990, Duros walked out of this very shop, down the steps and straight into a gunman's sights. The gunman was a desperate junkie paid by McPherson. He wouldn't get his hands dirty. He was shot in the head at point-blank range and died a few days later in a hospital. It's quite quiet here now. Maybe you can hear the tread upon the stair. Maybe you can feel the breath, the breeze around you as you stand here. Perhaps Angelo is here. Let us raise a toast to his cold, cold bones. Angelo Duros! Thank you. Close to home aspect of Leichhardt. This next tale concerns the building that's exactly opposite this store. And this building used to be the once grand Marlborough Picture Theatre, largest theatre in New South Wales. And there it is in its glory up there. It was owned by Messrs. T&W Humphreys, and for 6 years, since 1914 when it opened, it ran newsreels and double bills before closing its doors in 1920 for its major upgrade that would see it as that largest theatre in New South Wales. The revamped theatre, when it reopened, would have seating to accommodate 3,500 people and a modern installation of electric lighting. The project cost was in the region of £20,000. The King's ransom in those days. In the advertising running in the press in 1926, the Marlborough Picture Theatre was built alongside other major Sydney cinemas of the time. The Haverfield Theatre on Ramsay Street, the King's Cross Theatre in Darlinghurst, the Majestic Theatre in Hyde Park, all now gone. The new Annandale Theatre on Johnston Street. The Orpheum Theatre in North Sydney still remains. The Olympic Theatre at Bondi, the New York Cinema at George Street, and the Regal Cinema on the Great North Road in Five Dock. Most of those picture houses are now gone. In keeping up with the times, the Picture Theatre went through a further upgrade in the mid-30s, opening with a gala evening as the new Marlborough Theatre. The films screened on that opening night were Gold Diggers in Paris and The Amazing Dr. Clitterhouse. I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere. The screening commenced at 7:45 p.m. according to an advertisement in the Sydney Morning Herald. When CinemaScope arrived in Sydney in the 1950s, the theatre had the widest screen in the area. But unfortunately, the arrival of television from 1956 put pay to that, and numbers at the cinema dropped, and it closed its door for the last time in 1960. With its days as a theatre behind it, the building was metamorphosising into something else that was leading edge. It was Harold Hawkins Court, which doesn't sound very exciting, but if you were elderly and in need of care, it was the pinnacle of aged care anywhere in New South Wales. Behind the main building structure, apartments and landscape grounds provided a pleasant environment for residents. Harold Hawkins Court operated for another 40 years before it began its decline. And then it spent a few more years operating as a homeless hostel before finally being abandoned in the mid-2000s. The site remained empty and derelict, its frontage shuttered and locked to the pedestrian traffic of Norton Street with paint flaking off its walls, a very sinister sight indeed. In 2015, the powers that be decided to tart it up a bit. And they paid local artist Toby Thorby Lister or Skulk to paint a beautiful mural on the front elevation, swirling greens and blues and yellows, the colours adding some brightness to the then dreary area. But then, finally, in 2019, the building was demolished, and as you can see, the site has remained in the service of the aged of Leichhardt with a new aged care facility now under development. And that is it from my small selection of Dark Tales of Lost Leichhardt. Well, thank you very much. I thank you for your ears this evening, and think upon the tales I tell, for Dark Leichhardt will be waiting for you when you leave here tonight. And remember my words of advice for those taking the Great Western Highway home. Equally though, if you were to turn out here and turn right and go up the road, you would be crossing Pioneer Park, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. For a spooky surprise awaits you. Some 10,000 bodies are still lying buried under the earth of that park, in eternal rest at the old Balmain Cemetery. I'll leave you with that thought. Safe home.